The little girl was no taller than the dog's shoulder. She crossed the yard in her good dress and her scuffed church shoes, past more than 24 of the hardest men the United States Navy had ever made. She knelt down in the late afternoon grass in front of the old German shepherd and put her mouth close to his torn left ear. No one heard what she said, but every man there saw what happened next. The dog, who had stood rigid as a posted sentry through the entire ceremony, who the family swore had not once lain down in 2 years, let out a breath that shook his whole gray body and folded slowly down into the grass, pressed his face into the little girl's chest, as though he were setting down something he had been carrying for far too long. And every seal in that yard, men who had stood unflinching in the worst rooms on earth, went absolutely, completely still. One of them turned away toward the fence. Another put his hand over his mouth, because the 2 or 3 standing close enough had caught the words the child had whispered into that dog's ear.
And the words had belonged to a
Dead man. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with it until the very end. We read every single comment, and we'd love to know how far this one travels tonight. To understand why a yard full of the hardest men alive went still in the grass, you have to go back 2 years to a man named Petty Officer First Class Jake Hollis. Jake had been a SEAL and a dog handler, and the dog kneeling in that grass had been his. They had gone everywhere together, 3 deployments, 2 of them in places Jake had signed papers swearing never to name, and the bond between them had been the kind that the rest of the team used to talk about quietly when Jake wasn't around. The kind you only see a few times in a career. Jake had a wife named Megan and a daughter named Lily, who had been 4 years old the last time her father came home, 3 deployments worth of a habit he never broke. The night before he left, every single time, Jake would get down on one knee in the yard and take the big shepherd's face in both his hands and say the same 6 words into that notched ear. "Hold the line till I'm home." The whole team knew it. They'd ribbed him for it, and then, the way men do, started saying it to each other, until it stopped being a joke and became something closer to a prayer. And the dog had held the line. On the last deployment, when the vehicle ahead of Jake's took the blast that took Jake, the dog had pulled 2 wounded men out of the smoke before anyone could stop him. Jake did not come home. The dog never stopped waiting for him to. The man who had carried the folded flag to Megan Hollis's door, who had stood in that yard 2 years later organizing this whole quiet ceremony, was Senior Chief Petty Officer Jackson Hale. He was 42 years old and built like something assembled for endurance rather than show. 6 feet of lean, hard muscle going a little stiff in. The mornings now with sandy hair cut close and a jaw shadowed by a beard he kept because the Navy no longer got a say. There was a pale scar that split his right eyebrow and a careful favoring in his left shoulder where the hardware lived. His eyes were a deep weathered green, steady and slow to move, the kind of eyes that had learned to take in an entire space in a single unhurried sweep and had never, in all the years since, learned how to stop doing it at a backyard barbecue. He was not a hard man underneath. He had simply spent 20 years training the soft parts to wait their turn. He had done 5 deployments, the last 3 alongside Jake Hollis. He had loved him like a brother. And on a dark night in a staging area before that final rotation, Jake had said the thing men in that line of work always end up saying, "If anything happens to me, you look after my girls." And Jackson had said, of course, the way you say it when you don't really believe you'll ever have to. He'd had to. He had carried that promise for 2 years like a stone in his chest. And he had no idea, walking into that ceremony, he was about to find out how badly he'd been failing it. The dog's name was Ranger, and he was 11 years old now, gone gray to the muzzle, his hips stiff and his hearing failing on one side. He was a German shepherd of the old heavy build, black saddle over deep red tan. His left ear carried the notch where a piece of fragment had clipped it on the deployment that made him a legend in 3 teams. He had completed his service and earned a quiet retirement, and the team had spent a year and a half fighting paperwork and a federal program to make sure that retirement happened where it should. In the home of the family his handler had died for. But the dog who came home to Megan and Lily was not the dog Jake had left them. He did not play. He did not rest. He patrolled the fence line at all hours and lay each night at the front door facing the street. He stood through every gathering like a sentry who had not been told he could stand down, his eyes always going back to the gate, watching for a truck that was never going to pull into the drive again. The vet said there was nothing physically wrong with him. Megan, who understood grief better than any vet, said he was still holding the line. He was waiting for Jake to come home and release him, the way Jake always had, and Jake never would. Lily Hollis was 6 now, and she was the kind of child who breaks your heart by how little she lets it show. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and in the 2 years since the men in dress blues had come to the door she had appointed herself without anyone asking, the quiet woman of the house. She did not cry where her mother could see. She set the table. She made her own lunch some mornings so Megan could sleep the extra 10 minutes. She kept a photograph of a man in a uniform on her nightstand and talked to it sometimes, low, the way you talk to someone you're not entirely sure can hear you. She remembered her father in pieces, the smell of his jacket, the scratch of his beard, the sound of his boots. And she remembered, more clearly than almost anything, the way he used to kneel in the yard and hold Ranger's face and say something she'd been too little to fully understand at the time but had never, not once, forgotten. What none of the men gathered in that yard knew, what Jackson Hale was about to learn in the worst possible way, was that the Hollis family was being quietly torn apart from the inside, and had been for months. The trouble had a name, and the name was Richard Hollis. Richard was Jake's older brother by 9 years, and he had been for most of Jake's life simply a smooth, expensively dressed man who had walked away from the family after their father's funeral 15 years earlier over money, who had not come to Jake's wedding, who had not come to Jake's funeral, and who had surfaced again, like something rising off the bottom of a pond, exactly 4 months after the government life insurance payment and the survivor benefits had been finalized. Richard had a way about him. He was charming in rooms and cold in private, and he had spent those 4 months methodically working on a grieving widow alone in a house full of her husband's ghost, telling Megan that the estate had been handled improperly, that, as the eldest blood relative, he had rights to the family assets. Jake would have wanted his own family taken care of, that she'd be wise to settle quietly, rather than be dragged through a court that would surely side with him. He had a lawyer send letters on heavy paper. He had told her, more than once, with real tenderness in his voice, that she was in over her head, and that the house was really too much for a widow and a child. He had nearly convinced her. He had not counted on the fact that his dead brother had spent 20 years surrounded by men who keep their promises, that one of them was about to walk back into the yard. The ceremony itself was a small thing. Folding chairs on the grass, team in polos and ball caps, a little flag, a slow reading of the dog's service record, while the old shepherd stood at attention as if he understood every word, which Jackson had long since stopped doubting that he did. Megan held up well until the part where the citation named Jake, then she stopped holding up, and one of the men quietly put an arm around her shoulders. And when the formal words were done, little Lily Hollis got up out of her chair in her good dress and crossed the grass past all those still and watching men, knelt down in front of the dog her father had loved, and did the thing she had clearly been planning to do all afternoon. She took Ranger's gray face in both her small hands the exact way she had watched her daddy do it 100 years ago. She leaned in close to the torn ear and she whispered, "Daddy's not coming home, Ranger. I waited a really long time and he's not coming, so you don't have to hold the line anymore. It's okay, you did so good, you can rest now." That was when the dog let go. 2 years of rigid, faithful, hopeless waiting went out of him all at once, and he sagged down into the grass and pressed his face into the little girl's chest and stayed there. Lily wrapped her arms around his neck and held him, and that was when every operator in that yard who had heard Jake Hollis say "hold the line" till I'm home 100 times in 100 staging areas understood that the dead man's 6-year-old daughter had just done the one thing none of them had been able to do. She had released his dog from his post. Jackson Hale stood frozen with the citation still in his hand and tears running freely down a face that had not allowed itself that in 20 years, and he was not the only one. It was in that broken open silence that Megan, undone, finally told Jackson everything. The letters, the lawyer, Richard, the slow campaign to take the house and the benefits, and the last solid ground her daughter had left. And it was just then, with the timing that men like that always seem to have, that a clean, dark sedan pulled into the drive. Richard Hollis got out in a good coat, with a leather folder under his arm, having decided that a grieving family gathered together was the perfect soft moment to press his advantage. He did not understand, walking up that lawn, what the gathering was. He saw a yard full of men in ball caps. No idea he was walking into the middle of his dead brother's house. The old dog was on his feet before Richard reached the gate. Ranger came up out of the grass where he'd finally been resting and put himself between the man and the little girl and the widow, hackles up along his spine like a ridge, and let a low sound roll out of his chest that he had not made in 2 years, aimed, with no possibility of misunderstanding, at one man. Richard stopped. "Megan," he said, recovering his smile, ignoring the dog, ignoring the silent men. "We talked about this. I think it's time we sat down and were realistic about the house and the—" "That's far enough." Jackson Hale set the citation down on a folding chair and crossed the yard, and there was nothing loud in him at all, which is the most frightening thing a man like that can be. He told Richard who he was, his rank, his team, his 3 deployments at Jake's side. And he watched the smile on Richard's face begin, for the first time in his comfortable life, to falter. Jackson did something he had carried in his truck for 2 years without ever expecting to need it. Jake Hollis, who had known exactly what kind of man his brother was, had left a letter with his team before that last deployment, sealed, with 3 words on the front in Jake's blocky hand. "If Richard comes." Jackson had never opened it. He opened it now, in front of everyone. What was inside was Jake's own voice from beyond the grave. The beneficiary designations, clear and notarized, naming Megan and Lily and no one else. Copies of the will. And a single handwritten page that named exactly what Richard had done to the family 15 years before, and exactly what Jake feared he would try to do if the chance ever came, ending with a line Jackson read aloud in a yard gone silent as a church. "My family is Megan and Lily. My brother made his choice a long time ago. Don't let him near what they have left." Richard's face went through several things very quickly. He tried the lawyer. He tried his rights as blood. He tried, with real venom now, the line about a widow in over her head. And he said the thing that finished him. He could be a fool, and that sentiment doesn't hold up in court, in front of 24 men who had carried Jake's coffin. The yard did not stay silent at that. Didn't erupt either. It did something quieter and far worse for Richard. The men simply stood up, one by one, without a word. Every operator in that yard rose out of his folding chair and turned to face the man on the lawn, till Richard Hollis was standing alone at the bottom of a slope, looking up at a wall of his dead brother's brothers, none of them moving, none of them speaking, all of them looking at him with the flat, patient attention these men usually reserved for a threat. Jackson did not raise his voice or his hand. He simply held up Jake's letter and let the silence do its work. The silence in that yard was the heaviest thing any of those men had felt since the day they'd folded a flag into a triangle. One of the team, a quiet man who happened to be a JAG officer in his civilian life, stepped forward and explained to Richard, with great precision and very little warmth, exactly how little of what he'd been telling Megan was true. That Jake's beneficiary designations were, ironclad, that there was no estate to contest, that there never had been, and exactly how much trouble a man could find himself in, civil and otherwise, for the kind of sustained, documented pressure he'd been applying to a grieving widow alone in her home. Another man already had his phone out and was recording. A third had quietly stepped over to stand beside Megan and Lily. The rest had drawn in around them like a closing hand. Richard Hollis looked around the yard, at the men, at the letter, the dog still standing its line between him and the family, and he understood, all at once and far too late, that he was the only person there who had ever believed he would win. He turned and walked back down the lawn to his clean car, and he drove away. The dog watched the sedan until it was gone from the street the same way he had once watched the gate for a truck. By the following spring, the account had settled the slow, honest way real accounts do. The estate challenge evaporated the moment Richard's own lawyer read Jake's notarized designations and the letter. There had never been a real case, only a frightened woman alone. The team's JAG officer made sure the harassment was documented. Richard signed away any claim and any contact in exchange for the matter going no further than it had to. He did not come around again. Megan and Lily kept the house with Jake's name on the deed, and the porch where his boots used to sit. The men of the team did the thing they should have started doing 2 years before, and had simply, in their own grief, failed to do. They showed up. They took turns fixing the gutters and teaching Lily to ride a bike and being the small ordinary ways that matter most, the uncles a girl without a father needs. Jackson Hale came the most. He had a promise to keep. He had finally figured out that keeping it didn't look like a stone in his chest. It looked like Saturday mornings. On a warm gold evening that June, Jackson sat on the back steps of the Hollis house and watched Lily throw a tennis ball across the yard for an old, gray dog who could no longer run for it but trotted after it anyway, stiff-legged and happy, his tail going the whole way. Ranger had changed since the afternoon a 6-year-old set him free. He slept now. Deep, sprawled, untroubled sleep in patches of sun, the sleep of a soldier who has finally been told the war is over and has chosen at last to believe it. He no longer watched the gate. He had a little girl to follow instead, and he followed her everywhere. And at night he lay not at the front door facing the street but on the floor of Lily's room between her bed and the window, holding a different kind of line now, a gentler one, the only assignment he had left, and the one he would not have traded for anything. He brought the ball back to the little girl and dropped it at her feet and looked up at her, and his tail moved slow and easy through the warm grass. Lily knelt down and took his gray face in both her hands the way her father used to, and the old dog closed his eyes. Sometimes the bravest thing in the world is said in a whisper, by someone small enough that we forget they were listening all along. Sometimes the wound that won't close in a house full of grown soldiers is the one a child can reach, because she isn't trying to be strong, she's only trying to be honest. And honesty is a thing that even an old soldier's heart, even a dog's, knows how to answer. We spend so much of our strength holding lines we were never meant to hold forever, waiting for a release that has to come from outside us. But God has a way of sending that release through the most unexpected messengers, through a 6-year-old in a good dress, through a letter left in a drawer by a man who saw the danger coming, through a brotherhood that finally remembers a promise. No faithfulness is ever truly forgotten. Sometimes the person who finally tells us we can rest is the very one we thought we were holding the line to protect. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it is okay, at last, to set down the thing they have been carrying alone. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us, is there a line you've been holding for far too long, waiting for someone to tell you that you can rest? Your words tonight might be the light somebody is waiting for, and if you believe in stories of loyalty, promises kept, love that outlasts the grave, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, Watch over every faithful heart still standing a post no one has released them from. And remind you always, your watch has been seen, faithfulness is counted, and you are never ever alone.